Hi there, I'm Dr. Luke Maynard, and I'd like to welcome you to Cynehelm, my online portal for criticism, education, creativity, the arts and letters, and especially today, cultural studies in the world of geek culture. The Cynehelm project is an experimental portal for what I'd like to call free scholarship, the pursuit of public intellectualism, the arts and letters, independent of formal academia, universities, colleges, and so on. But as the nature of arts education changes, and that's the subject of a later sort of manifesto, there's going to be a lot more bleed over in the things that have been traditionally held to be academic in nature, like, say, 18th-century Gothic literature, and the things that have traditionally held not to be academic, like, say, Star Wars. Because this project is meant to dissolve some of the difference between the highbrow world of theory and criticism and the everyday world of people who love stories and like talking about them, big secret, those are more or less the same thing, I thought I'd start by sharing a talk I gave at the International Congress of the Humanities that unites both of these things, classical Gothic literature and Star Wars, in ways I hope are interesting to people with a formal scholarly interest, but also to general fandoms of one or the other. I've broken this talk into 3 tiny sections because, in my experience, the bell curve of the attention span on things like YouTube optimizes around 5, 6, 7 minutes. But I recommend watching all 3 parts in one go if you can. I'll put a title card up here in case you want to cite this talk. Numinous beings are we, dead hands, dark fathers, and the Gothic materiality of Star Wars. Bear in mind I wrote this before Episode 7 came out. It doesn't take Episode 7 or the expanded universe into very much account, and so you can safely proceed without worrying about spoilers for The Force Awakens if you somehow haven't seen it. To anyone who's seen the Star Wars trilogy and knows a bit about Gothic literary criticism, there shouldn't be anything surprising about doing a Gothic reading of Star Wars, at least in a sense. But to my surprise, I haven't found a single sustained study of the Star Wars films as a Gothic text. The Cambridge Companion to Gothic Fiction, edited by Gerald Hogel, which is one of the standard texts of Gothic criticism, makes allowance for a Gothic undercurrent in a lot of 80s and 90s sci-fi from what I would call geek culture. Ridley Scott's Blade Runner, James Cameron's Terminator films, the TV series The X-Files, and even the video game Doom all get a fair mention. But what surprises me is that nobody's really talked about Star Wars in detail as a Gothic romance, given that for some reasons I will start to lay out here, that's exactly what it is. What people have been quick to pick up on is one very specific dimension of the Gothic in these films, and that is the saga's Freudian or Oedipal overtones. Oedipus is the king in Greek tragedy who's driven to kill his father and have sex with his mother. It's a model that Freudian critics see symbolically repeated just about everywhere in literature. In Star Wars, it's not just Luke who gets to live out the Oedipal role. The entire franchise is now steeped in patricidal and incestuous overtones, right down to Episode 7, in which, in the minds of many fans, J.J. Abrams is the son who slays the father, who comes into his full strength and redeems Lucas. The gifted young chosen one who gave himself over to the machine so many years ago, and so on and so forth. On every level, even counting the new trilogy, there are countless ways we can read the Star Wars saga as an Oedipal drama. If it takes us until 46 minutes into Return of the Jedi, when Luke Skywalker at last blurts out, "I can't kill my own father," to realize that we're watching the unfolding of an Oedipal drama, we really haven't been paying much attention. That's not to say that Oedipal readings of Star Wars haven't been simple or even uniform. In 1984, Arthur Berger read the trilogy as an anti-Oedipal morality tale, reading Return of the Jedi as an Oedipal showdown with the Emperor as the stand-in for the absent mother, the passive, what he calls the sexually ambivalent figure, over whose affections father and son stage their phallic duel. The ending is heroic rather than tragic only because Luke resists the destiny of Oedipus and rejects the Freudian myth. Back in 1978, well before the father-son conflict was made explicit, and probably before even Lucas was sure it would become literalized, Andrew Gordon had a much different take on who the Oedipal father figure was in Star Wars. We can see how Lucas attempts to make this essentially Oedipal fable guilt-free. Vader, a destructive devil, acts out Luke's patricidal desires. So, back before Empire, with only the one film to go on, Gordon reads Obi-Wan Kenobi as the sacrificial father figure, and Vader as the Jungian shadow for Luke, fulfilling the Oedipal impulse that Luke's conscious ego can't. Does this old reading of the first film still hold up after the paternity test comes back in the later ones? Maybe, maybe not. It does open up some nuanced possibilities in the way we read Star Wars psychologically. It gives us an alternate reading of Luke's trial at the cave on Dagobah, for instance, which leads to what I'd call a Lacanian moment of identification, as he witnesses his own face, rather than Anakin's behind the mask. It also helps us to find a little more depth in the much maligned New Trilogy, episodes 1 to 3. George Lucas is no stranger to pop psychology, and he's talked about these films as rhyming with the originals. I want to suggest that whether you like the films or not, they are a conscious Jungian shadow of the original 3 films, a counterfeit Gothic shadow trilogy that swaps virtue for self-indulgence, not just in terms of its direction, but in terms of its protagonist, and with predictably tragic consequences in both cases. Based on Andrew Gordon's early reading, I want to suggest that Anakin, just as in Episode 4, isn't just Luke's father in the new trilogy. He operates as Luke's own repressed Jungian shadow. The 3-film arc of the new trilogy is an uncanny repetition of the original Oedipal story of the original trilogy, remediated by the inversion of the hero. In this version, the phallic contest before the affectionate Dark Mother, Palpatine, ends with the acceptance, rather than the heroic rejection, of the Oedipal destiny, as the Shadow Luke, Anakin, disarms, then beheads the motherly Emperor's deep-voiced, hyper-masculine Dark Lord, Count Dooku, and swiftly takes his place. The penalty for this act, as in the original Oedipus myth, is not just a maiming but a mythical blinding behind the mask of Vader. Think of that shot of the mask coming down with the red eyes. Think of Vader's curious plea at the end of Return of the Jedi, "Let me look on you with my own eyes." It's a reversal of the Oedipal tragedy with shades of the Fisher King myth. By refusing to repeat the Oedipal cycle, Luke heals his father, restores his father's eyes rather than sacrificing his own. So there's lots of reasons already to read Star Wars in a really typical Freudian way. This is fairly obvious, and in film criticism this part has happened a lot. The Oedipal rabbit hole is pretty bottomless, and will probably never be exhausted. But this kind of thinking about Star Wars as a father-son saga is so common and so obvious among both fans and critics that there must be other ways of thinking about Star Wars as a Gothic story. Is it Gothic only because it satisfies these Freudian conditions of a psychological drama between father and son? I want to think about what other kinds of Gothic resonance permeate the films. There's a lot more to Gothic criticism than repeating the same Oedipal and Freudian observations over and over. And so what I want to do in part 2 of this talk is set aside the most familiar Gothic terms of Star Wars and look at a few other aspects of Gothic criticism that might have something to say about the films. Our first step, you might say, into a larger world.